Section 3 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 2. The Walled Town and Its Streets. Part 1. In the medieval city, the proper protection of the municipality and the citizens largely depended on the condition of the walls and gates. The government of town life was specially congenial to the Norman, and the laws he made for the purpose were stringent, while the Saxon, who never appreciated town life, preferred the county organization. Thus it will be found that, as the laws of the latter were too lax, those of the former were too rigorous. Riley, referring to the superfluity of Norman laws, describes them as, quote, laws which, while unfortunately they created or protected few real valuable rights, gave birth to many and grievous wrongs. End quote. He proceeds to amplify this opinion and gives good reason for the condemnation he felt bound to pronounce. Quote, that the favoured and so-called free citizen of London even, despite the extensive privileges in reference to trade which he enjoyed, was in possession of more than the faintest shadow of liberty, can be hardly allowed if we only call to mind the substance of the enactments and ordinances, arbitrary, illiberal, and oppressive. Laws, for example, which compelled each citizen, whether he would or no, to be bail and surety for a neighbour's good behaviour, over whom it was perhaps impossible for him to exercise the slightest control. Laws which forbade him to make his market for the day until the purveyors for the king and the great lords of the land had stripped the stalls of all that was choicest and best. Laws which forbade him to pass the city walls for the purpose of meeting his own purchased goods. Laws which bound him to deal with certain persons and communities only, or within the precincts only of certain localities. Laws which dictated, under severe penalties, what sums and no more he was to pay to his servants and artisans. Laws which drove his dog out of the streets, while they permitted genteel dogs to roam at large. Nay, even more than this, laws which subjected him to domiciliary visits from the city officials on various pleas and pretexts, which compelled him to carry on a trade under heavy penalties, irrespective of the question whether or not it was at his loss, and which occasionally went so far as to lay down rules at what hours he was to walk in the streets, and incidentally what he was to eat and what to drink. End quote. We see from this quotation that the position of the inhabitant of a walled town was not a happy one. Still, he was more favoured than his neighbour who lived in the country. A few examples will show us what the city life was, and these specific instances are necessary, for so many centuries have passed since Englishmen lived in a walled town, that without them it is barely possible for us to conceive what this life of suspicion and fear of danger was really like. The one thing which we do see distinctly is the gradual emancipation of the Englishman from the wearing thraldom of his position. He went on gradually in this course, always bearing towards the light, and he gained freedom long before the citizens of other countries. In the 15th century, we find that galling laws here in England were allowed to fall into desuetude in favour of freedom, while the same rules were retained in foreign countries. Some of our countrymen objected to this, and English merchants were irritated to find that, while the regulation enjoining every alien merchant during his residence in London to abide in the house of a citizen assigned to him as a host by the magistrates had fallen into abeyance, the restriction was rigidly enforced abroad. The writer of the remarkable Libel of English Policy, 1437, alludes to this feeling. Quote, what reason is't that we should go to host in these countries, and in this English coast they should not so, but have more liberty than we ourselves? End quote. The citizens had to put up with constant surveillance. The gates were closed early in the evening, and at curfew all lights, as well as fires, had to be put out. Night walkers, male and female, and roisterers generally had a bad time of it, but probably they were very ill-behaved, and in many cases they doubtless deserved the punishment they received. In the year 1100, Henry I relaxed these stringent regulations and restored to his subjects the use of lights at night. The streets were first lighted by lanterns in 1415. London within the walls was a considerable city in the Middle Ages, although it only contained the same area that was walled in during the later Roman period. The relics of this wall, continually renewed with the old materials, are so few, and the old area is so completely lost sight of in the larger London, that it is necessary to point out the line of the walls before dealing further with the habits of the Londoners. It was long supposed that the Ludgate was the chief entrance to the city from the west, but, in spite of its name, there can be little doubt that for some centuries the great western approach was made through Newgate. We will therefore commence our walk round the walls with that gate. Although there can be no doubt that here was a gate in the Roman period, we have little or no record of its early history. One of its earlier names was Chamberlain's Gate. The new gate was erected in the reign of Henry I, and in a pipe roll of 1188 it is mentioned as a prison. In 1414, the prison was in such a loathsome condition that the keeper and 64 of the prisoners died of the prison plague. In consequence of this, it was decided to rebuild the gate. Richard Whittington was the moving spirit in this rebuilding, and it is supposed that he paid the expenses. In the course of excavations made in 1874 to 1875 for the improvement of the western end of Newgate Street, the massive foundations of Whittington's Gate were discovered several feet below the present roadway. The wall passed north through the precincts of Christ's Church, Christ's Hospital, formerly occupied by the Greyfriars or Franciscans. The town ditch, which was outside the walls and arched over about the year 1553, ran through the hospital grounds. The wall then turned round to the north of Newgate Street and passed into St. Martin's le Grand, where, in 1889, the foundations of several houses on the west side were exposed while the excavations for the latest addition to the General Post Office were being proceeded with. The great bell of the Collegiate Church of St. Martin's told the curfew hour when all the gates of the city were to be shut. The great gates were shut at the first stroke of the bell at St. Martin's, and the wickets opened. At the last stroke, the wickets were to be closed, and not to be opened afterward that night unless by special precept of the mayor. The ringing of the curfew of St. Martin's was to be the signal for the ringing, quote, at every parish church, so that they begin together and end together, end quote. In an ordinance, Edward III, 1363, the bell at the Church of Our Lady at Bow was substituted for that at St. Martin's. Outside the walls was Smithfield, where the tournaments were held, and Giltspur Street, where knights bought their spears and armour might be repaired when tournaments were going on. Within the gate were the Greyfriars, Stinking Lane, now King Edward Street, and the Butcher's Shambles in Newgate Street. St. Paul's had its enclosed churchyard, so that the main thoroughfare for centuries passed round it from Newgate Street to Cheapside. The name of Cheap tells of the general market held there, and the names of several of the streets out of Cheapside tell of the particular merchandise appropriated to them, as Friday Street, Friday's Market for Fish, Milk Street, and Bread Street. At the west end of Cheapside was the Church of St. Michael le Quern, or At the Corn, which marked the site of the Corn Market. It was destroyed in the Great Fire. At the east end of this church stood the old cross, which was taken down in the year 1390 and replaced by the little conduit, which is described as standing by Paul's Gate. There is an engraving of this church and the conduit, with the waterpots of the water carriers dotted about. The wall passed north along the side of St. Martin's le Grand till it came to Aldersgate, close by the church of St. Botolph. The exact spot is marked by number 62 on the east side of the street. Stowe's etymologies of London names are seldom very satisfactory, but he never blundered worse than when he explained Aldgate as the Old Gate and Aldersgate as the Older Gate. But his explanation has been followed by many successive writers who do not seem to have seen the impossibility of the suggestion. One of the earliest forms of the name is Aldridsgate, showing pretty conclusively that it was a proper name. The wall proceeds east to Cripplegate with an outpost, the Watchtower or Barbican. The Reverend W. Denton has explained the name of Cripplegate as due to the covered way between the postern and the Barbican or Burkenning. Anglo-Saxon, Crepel, Criffel, or Crippel, a burrow or passage underground. The name occurs also in the Domesday of Wiltshire, where we read, quote, "To Wonsdyke, thenceforth by the dyke to Cripplegate." End quote. If this etymology be accepted, we have here the use of the word gate as a way. In the north, this distinction is kept up, and the road is the gate, while what we in the south call the gate is the bar. For instance, at York, Micklegate is the road, and the entrance to the wall is Micklegate Bar. It may be noted that St. Giles was the patron saint of cripples, but the first church was not built until about 1090 by Alfune, the first hospitaller of St. Bartholomew's, so that the dedication may have been owing to a mistaken etymology at that early date. In the churchyard is an interesting piece of the old wall still in position. The course of the wall to the east is marked by the street named London Wall, from Cripplegate to Bishopsgate Street. Here it bore south to Camomile and Wormwood Streets, where stood, till 1731, the gate. The distance between Cripplegate and Bishopsgate is not great, and much of the space outside the walls was occupied by Moorditch. Still, in 1415, Thomas Falconer, then mayor, opened a postern in the wall, where Moorgate Street now is, for the benefit of the hay and wood carts coming to the markets of London. He must also have made a road across the morass of Moorfields, for that place was not drained until more than a century afterwards. The site of Bishopsgate is marked by 2 tablets on the houses at the corner of Camomile and Wormwood Streets respectively, numbers 1 and 64 Bishopsgate Street without, inscribed with a mitre and these words, quote, "Adjoining to this spot, Bishopsgate formerly stood." End quote. Footnote: It is scarcely creditable to the city authorities that no mark of the position of the other gates has been set up. To place these memorials would be an easy thing to do, and this attention to historical topography would be highly appreciated by all Londoners. The mark of Aldgate should take the form of a statue of Chaucer, who lived at that gate for some years. The corporation would honour themselves by doing further honour to the great Englishman, who was also one of the greatest of Londoners, if they placed at the great eastern entrance to London a full-length effigy of the son of one of London's worthy merchants. This would be in addition to the gift of a bust to Guildhall by Sir Reginald Hanson. The line of the wall should also be marked, but this would be a more difficult operation. End of footnote. Bishopsgate was named after Erkenwald, Bishop of London. Died 685, son of Offa, King of Mercia, by whom it was erected. At first, the maintenance of the gate was considered to devolve upon the Bishop of London, but after an agreement with the Hanse merchants, it was ruled that the bishop, quote, "is bound to make the hinges of Bishopsgate, seeing that from every cart laden with wood he has one stick as it enters the said gate." End quote. The liability was limited to the hinges, for after some dispute it was, 1305, quote, awarded and agreed that Almains belonging to the house of the merchants of Almain shall be free from paying 2 shillings on going in or out of the gate of Bishopsgate with their goods, seeing that they are charged with the safekeeping and repair of the gate. End quote. The line of the wall bears southward to Aldgate and is marked by the street named Houndsditch. The earliest form of the name Aldgate appears to have been Alegate or Algate, and therefore has nothing to do with old, the D being intrusive. Within the walls was the great house of Christ Church, founded by Queen Maud or Matilda, wife to Henry I, in the year 1108, and afterwards known as the Priory of the Holy Trinity within Aldgate. In 1115, the famous Knighton Guild, possessors of the ward of Portsoken, which was the soak without the port or gate called Aldgate, presented to the priory all their rights, offering upon the altars of the church the several charters of the guild. The king confirmed the gift, and the prior became ex officio an alderman of London. This continued to the dissolution of the religious houses, when the inhabitants of the ward obtained the privilege of electing their own alderman. Stowe tells us that he remembered the prior riding forth with the mayor as one of the aldermen. Quote, these priors have sitten and ridden amongst the aldermen of London, in livery like unto them, saving that his habit was in shape of a spiritual person, as I myself have seen in my childhood. End quote. The old name of Christ Church is retained in St. Catherine Cree, or Christ Church, on the north side of Leadenhall Street, which was built in the cemetery of the dissolved priory. This church was taken down in 1628, and the present building erected in 1630. The wall led south by the line of the street now called the Minories to the Tower, thus dividing Great Tower Hill, which was within the wall, from Little Tower Hill, which was outside. The Abbey of Nuns of the Order of St. Clare, which was situated outside the city walls, gave its name of Minoresses to the street. When William the Conqueror built the tower, he encroached upon the city ground, a proceeding which was not popular with his subjects. Near Tower Hill, that is out of George Street, Trinity Square, there is a fine fragment of the old London Wall. We must now turn westward and follow the course of the river from the Custom House to the Blackfriars, as this forms the southern boundary of the city. A little to the west of the Tower Gate was Galley Quay, where, according to Stowe, quote, the galleys of Italy and other parts were used to unlade and land their merchandises and wares. End quote. These strangers, inhabitants of Genoa and other parts, lodged, says Stowe, in Galley Row, near Mincing Lane. They, quote, were commonly called galleymen, as men that came up in the galleys, brought up wines and other merchandises, which they landed in Thames Street, at a place called Galley Quay. They had a certain coin of silver amongst themselves, which were halfpence of Genoa, and were called galley halfpence. These halfpence were forbidden in the 13th of Henry IV, and again by Parliament in the 4th of Henry V. Notwithstanding, in my youth I have seen them pass current, but with some difficulty, for that the English halfpence were then, though not so broad, somewhat thicker and stronger. End quote. Next Galley Quay was Bear Quay, appropriated chiefly to the landing and shipment of corn. The first custom house of which we have any account was built by John Churchman, Sheriff of London, in 1385, and stood on Customers Quay, to the east of the present building, and therefore much nearer Tower Wharf. Another and a larger building was erected in the reign of Elizabeth, and burnt in the Great Fire of 1666. Wren designed the third building, which was completed in 1671, and destroyed by fire in 1718. Ripley's building, which succeeded this, was destroyed in the same way in 1814. The present is therefore the fifth building devoted to the customs of the country. Billingsgate must be of great antiquity, but it has not always held its present undisputed position. In early times, Queenhithe and Billingsgate were the chief city wharfs for the mooring of fishing vessels and landing their cargoes. The fish were sold in and about Thames Street, special stations being assigned to the several kinds of fish. Queenhithe was at first the more important wharf, but Billingsgate appears to have gradually overtaken it, and eventually to have left it quite in the rear, the troublesome passage of London Bridge leading the shipmasters to prefer the below-bridge wharf. Corn, malt, and salt, as well as fish, were landed and sold at both wharves, and very strict regulations were laid down by the city authorities as to the tolls to be levied on the several articles, and the conditions under which they were to be sold. In 1282, a message was sent from Edward I to the sergeants of Billingsgate and Queenhithe, commanding them, quote, "to see that all boats are moored on the city side at night," end quote. And in 1297 the order was repeated, but it was now directed to the warden of the dock at Billingsgate and the warden of Queenhithe, who were, quote, "to see that this order is strictly observed," end quote. Opposite to Billingsgate, on the north side of Lower Thames Street, the foundations of a Roman villa were discovered in 1847, when the present coal exchange was built. A spring of clear water which supplied the Roman baths was found running through the ruins at the time of the excavations. This was the spring which supplied the boss, fountain or jet by the corner of an opening, of old called Boss Alley, where a reservoir was erected by Sir Richard Whittington or his executors, expressly for the use of the inhabitants and market people. We now come to London Bridge, the great southern approach to London, and the most important strategical position, as when that was fortified, the inhabitants were safe from attack on the south. Passing westward from the bridge, we come to the Old Swan Stairs, the Steel Yard, Cold Harbour, Dowgate, and the Vintry, and then we come to Queenhithe, said to have been named after Eleanor, widow of Henry II, to whom it belonged. It was previously known as Edred's Hythe. Passing Paul's Wharf, we come to the vast building known as Baynard's Castle, built by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, in 1428. This mansion had an eventful history until it was destroyed in the Great Fire. A previous Baynard's Castle was situated on the Thames nearer the Fleet River, which was named after Ralph Baynard, one of the Norman knights of William the Conqueror. It afterwards came into the possession of Robert Fitzwalter, chief bannerer or castellan of the City of London. When the Dominicans or Blackfriars removed from Holborn to Ludgate, they swallowed up in their precincts the Tower of Montfichet and Castle Baynard, which were the strongholds built at the west end of the city. Edward I allowed the friars to pull down the city wall and take in all the land to the west as far as the River Fleet. Moreover, the king intimated to the mayor and citizens his desire that the new wall should be built at the cost of the city. We here pass up to Ludgate, which does not appear to have been a gate of much importance until the beginning of the 13th century. The idea that it is named after a mythical King Lud is, of course, exploded now, and there are at present two etymologies to choose from. Dr. Edwin Freshfield supposes the name to be derived from the word lode, a cut or drain into a large stream. The main stream of the Fleet passes from the Thames to the foot of Ludgate Hill, but a short branch went in a north-eastward direction to Ludgate, joining there the town ditch. Mr. Lofty explains Ludgate as a postern, and supposes it to have existed in the Saxon period as a postern gate. All along the riverfront of London originally there was a wall, remains of which have been found at various times. Fitzstephen, writing in the 12th century, says, quote, "London formerly had walls and towers on the south, but that most excellent river the Thames, which abounds with fish, and in which the tide ebbs and flows, runs on that side, and has in a long space of time washed down, undermined, and subverted the walls in that part." End quote. Outside Ludgate, the road to the west was not much frequented. Fleet Street and the Strand were not the important thoroughfares during the Middle Ages that Holborn was. The roads were much neglected, and no one traversed them who could travel by boat on the Thames, which was literally the silent highway of London. When the gates of London were closed at 8 o'clock at night, and the inhabitants were ruled with an iron hand, it was somewhat a sign of reproach to live outside the walls. This feeling continued for centuries, and the name of suburbs was long held in little respect. In spite of this stigma, the main avenues leading to the several gates became inhabited, and in course of time were added to the City of London as liberties. The extent of these liberties was marked by bars. Thus, outside Ludgate was Temple Bar, outside Newgate, Holborn Bars, outside Aldersgate, Aldersgate Bars, outside Bishopsgate, Bishopsgate Bars, and outside Aldgate, Aldgate Bars. After this arrangement, the liberties were no longer suburbs, and the disreputable neighbourhood was therefore pushed farther out. The suburbs outside Cripplegate were unlike those of any of the other gates. There was no main road straight north, but a village with a church and a Fore Street grew up outside the walls. There is a great deal of information respecting the protection of the walls and the city gates in the important series of letter books preserved among the city archives and in Riley's Memorials. The authorities were allowed by the king to levy a tax called muirage from time to time on goods entering the city to enable them to keep the wall and gate in a state of efficiency. In 1276, Edward I called upon the citizens to devote a portion of the dues to the rebuilding of the city walls by the House of the Blackfriars, and 8 years after, the grant of muirage was renewed to the mayor and citizens on condition that they built this wall, so that for some years the city gained no particular advantage from the king's license. The Hanse merchants were freed from payment of muirage on account of their engagement to keep Bishopsgate in order. In 1310, a royal writ was issued for the punishment of those who injured the city walls, gates, and posterns. 2 years before this date, special orders were issued as to the guard of the gates. The wards adjoining each gate had to supply a certain number of men-at-arms. Newgate was supplied with 26 men, Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Ludgate, and Bridgegate with 24 each, Cripplegate and Aldersgate with 20 each. The authorities were often very parsimonious, and we find in Riley this curious entry under the date of 1314. Quote, "Removal of an elm near Bishopsgate, and purchase of a cord for a ward hook with the proceeds of the sale thereof." End quote. Some of the gates were let as dwelling houses, Chaucer's tenancy of Aldgate being a familiar instance, but this practice was found to be very inconvenient and objectionable, and in 1386 an enactment was issued forbidding the grant in future of the city gates or of the dwelling houses there. There must have been accommodation at the gates, even when let as dwelling houses, for the sergeants who performed the duty of opening and closing the gates. One of the orders that these sergeants had to carry into effect was to prevent the admission of lepers into the town. Money was collected at the gates for the repair of the roads, a charge which was in addition to muirage. The sergeants also had to see that a fugitive bondman did not enter the city, because if one gained admittance and resided in a chartered town for a year and a day, he obtained freedom and was entitled to the franchise. In small towns it was easier to keep out the fugitive, but in a large city like London he could often escape notice, although the authorities might be against him. In Letter Book A, we read this notice, quote, "Pray that the said fugitives may not be admitted to the freedom of the city." End quote. And Pollock and Maitland write, quote, "The townsmen were careful not to obliterate the distinction between bond and free, and did not admit one of servile birth to the citizenship." End quote. There can be little doubt that there was much laxity in keeping the gates at various times, and in cases where there was fear of invasion, the king sent special orders to the mayor to see to the protection of the city. In spite of the singular freedom of England from invasion, the English have constantly been overwhelmed with panic, fearing the worst which never came. In 1335, an alarm was raised of a French invasion. The king, at the beginning of August, wrote to order all men between 16 and 60 to be arrayed, and a council to be immediately held in London. Leaders of the Londoners were appointed who were to defend the city in case the enemy landed. Again, in 1370, preparations were made for an expected attack upon the city, and in 1383, false reports were circulated from the war in Flanders, for the circulation of which an impostor was punished. 3 years later, the citizens were in great terror on account of a widespread report that the French king was about to invade England. There seems to have been something in the report, because Harry Hotspur believed it, and having waited impatiently for the French king to besiege Calais, returned to England to meet him here. Stowe, however, was very satirical about the English fears. He wrote, quote, "The Londoners, understanding that the French king had got together a great navy, assembled an army, and set his purpose firmly to come into England, they, trembling like leverets, fearful as mice, seek starting holes to hide themselves in, even as if the city were now to be taken. And they that in times past bragged they would blow all the Frenchmen out of England, hearing now a vain rumour of the enemy's coming, they run to the walls, break down the houses adjoining, destroy and lay them flat, and do all things in great fear, not one Frenchman yet having set foot on shipboard. What would they have done if the battle had been at hand, and the weapons over their head?" End quote. No improvement in the condition of houses in London appears to have taken place until long after the Conquest, and the low huts, closely packed together, which filled the streets during the Saxon period, were continued well into the 13th century. These houses were wholly built of wood, and thatched with straw or reeds. All medieval cities were fatally liable to destruction by fire, but London appears to have been specially unfortunate in this respect. In the first year of the reign of Stephen, a destructive fire spread from London Bridge to the Church of St. Clement Danes, destroying St. Paul's in the way. This fire caused some improvements in building, but special regulations were required, and one of the early works undertaken by the newly established commune was the drawing up, in 1189, of the famous Assize of Building, known by the name of the first mayor as Fitz-Aylwin's Assize. In this document, the following statement was made. Quote, "Many citizens, to avoid such danger, built, according to their means, on their ground, a stone house covered and protected by thick tiles against the fury of fire, whereby it often happened that when a fire arose in the city and burnt many edifices, and had reached such a house, not being able to injure it, it there became extinguished, so that many neighbours' houses were wholly saved from fire by that house." End quote. Various privileges were conceded to those who built in stone, and these privileges are detailed in the Assize of 1189. No provision, however, was made as to the material to be used in roofing tenements. This Assize, which has been described as the earliest English building act, is of the greatest value to us from an historical point of view, and much attention is paid to it in Hudson Turner's Domestic Architecture, where a translation of the Assize is printed. Turner points out that it is evident from this specimen of early civic legislation that although citizens might, if it so pleased them, construct their houses entirely of stone, yet they were not absolutely required to do more than erect party walls 16 feet in height, the materials of the structure built on such walls being left entirely to individual choice, and there can be no doubt that in the generality of houses it was of wood. This assumption is justified by the fact that, in deeds of a much later period, houses constructed wholly of stone are frequently named as boundaries, without any further or more special description than that such was the substance of which they were built. Turner adds that it is obvious that such a description would have been vague and insufficient in a district where houses were generally raised in stone, and he therefore supposes that the Assize of 1189 had no more direct effect than in regulating the method of constructing party walls, and then only in cases where individuals were willing to build in stone. There can be no doubt that the Assize had but little effect, for in 1212 a still more destructive fire occurred which destroyed part of London Bridge, then a wooden structure, and the Church of St. Mary Overy, Southwark. It raged for 10 days, and it is calculated that 1,000 persons, men, women, and children, lost their lives in the fire. This fire had a striking effect upon the authorities, for at once they set to work to enact a new ordinance which introduced certain compulsory regulations. This is known as Fitz-Aylwin's Second Assize, 1212, and thus the first mayor, about whom little else is known, is associated with two important acts, one issued at the beginning and the other near the end of his long mayoralty. Thenceforth, everyone who built a house was strictly charged not to cover it with reeds, rushes, stubble, or straw, but only with tiles, shingle boards, or lead. In future, in order to stop a fire, houses could be pulled down in case of need with an alderman's hook and cord. For the speedy removal of burning houses, each ward was to provide a strong iron hook with a wooden handle, 2 chains, and 2 strong cords, which were to be left in the charge of a beadle of the ward, who was also provided with a good horn, loudly sounding. It was also ordered that occupiers of large houses should keep 1 or 2 ladders for their own house and for their neighbours in case of a sudden outbreak of fire. Also, they were to keep in summer a barrel or large earthen vessel full of water before the house, for the purpose of quenching fire, unless there was a reservoir of spring water in the curtilage or courtyard. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. End of Section 3.